All right, so we are in the bottom of DAF Lamed Amud Beis, and what we're discussing is putting down an ERU for a Kohen in a Beis HaKvaros in a cemetery. And Rabbi Yehuda said that that's okay because you can always access it even as a Kohen by being transported in a box. And the Gemara had said that you have to say that according to Rabbi Yehuda, an Ohel Zaruk is still considered to be an Ohel, a moving Ohel. Now, there's a machlokes on this matter, whether a moving Ohel is considered to be an Ohel, because on the one hand, an Ohel by definition is something that's meant not to be a kli. It's a stationary enclosure. So therefore, it's a chiddush to say that that which serves as an Ohel can be portable. But I guess because the person's inside it and vis-a-vis the person, it is stationary. It's only vis-a-vis the outside world that it's moving. So then it's considered to be a legitimate Ohel, at least according to Rabbi Yehuda. And that's what protects him in order to be carried into the cemetery and allows him to access his ERU. Now, the Gemara now says, on the bottom line of Daf Lamed Amud Beis, V'ha d'Tanya, Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Ma'arvin l'kohen tohor b'truma tahora b'kever. So, in this scenario, we're not talking about a cemetery anymore. In this scenario, we're actually talking about a grave. Now, a grave is much more problematic than accessing truma in a cemetery. Truma in a cemetery, okay, mela is one thing. You have to circumvent all the other graves before you're able to access the truma. But here we're talking about where the truma is mamish resting over a grave or in a grave, so that you have multiple problems. You have the problem that the truma itself is going to become tameh, in which case it's not edible. And remember, we're learning this sugya according to Sumchus, who says that the only way the ERU can be kona shvisa, can acquire domain for an individual, is if it's edible to him right now. So we have to obviate the problem of the truma itself becoming tameh and being rendered inedible. And we also have to deal with the problem of the kohen accessing the truma. Because by a cemetery, he can stick his hand out of the box and pick it up. But over here, if he sticks his hand out of the box, he's going to become tameh because he's going to be touching something that's right over the grave. So how's he going to access it? So now, the Gemara says as follows. We have a brisa that says you're nevertheless allowed to make an ERU when the truma for a kohen is tohor and is resting on top of a grave. So heichi azil. So first of all, how are you going to get it? We're assuming that perhaps it's in a cemetery or that you have to traverse an area of corpses before you get there. So the Gemara says, B'shida teva umigdal. So, okay, fine. We can surmount the problem of accessing it via a cemetery by carrying the guy in a box. But over here we have a greater problem because the Hacohen, the achta, itamula. But the truma itself, once it's resting on the grave, automatically becomes tameh. So the Gemara says, "B'shelo huchshara o shenilo shabimei peros." So the Gemara gives a very interesting answer that the food item that we're dealing with was not primed to receive tuma, either because we're dealing with a bag of potatoes that never came in contact with water after it was harvested, in which case even when it's touching tuma, it does not become tameh, or we're dealing with a loaf of bread where the liquid ingredient was fruit juice, which is not one of the 7 liquids that prime something to be makabel tuma. So the Gemara now says, okay, fine, you've surmounted the problem of the truma itself not becoming tameh, but vehechi maisila, but how are you going to access the truma? Answers the Gemara, v'pshute kli eitz delo makabel tuma. Okay, so the answer is that you're going to have to stand at the side, whether you're in your box or whether this is just a solitary grave outside of a cemetery. You won't be able to access the box directly because you can't put your hand over the grave. So you'll have to take some kind of utensil that is made out of wood that is not concave and therefore is not going to be makabel tuma. And you'll have to use that as your as an instrument to grab the tuma. So just imagine one of those accordion extenders. You stick that out, you'll grab it, pull it back, one of those gadgets, you'll pull it back to you. one of those things you see advertised at 2 in the morning, and then you'll be fine. So now the Gemara says, Vaha kamahil. But frek the Gemara, but wait a minute. What about the fact that it's forming an ohel over the tumah? Now here's the principle. If you have anything that is at least 1 tefach wide that is overhanging a source of tumah, then even if I'm not underneath the ohel, I'm just holding on to the ohel, then I become tameh. So the assumption is that this kli that I'm dealing with is 1 tefach wide, and therefore it constitutes an ohel, and I'm touching it. So the Gemara says, Demaisi la achude. That's the Rashi's girsa. Answers the Gemara that what you do is you turn it on its narrow side, which means that it'll be less than 1 tefach wide. We could be talking about a stick, let's say, and you turn it on its narrow side so it's not forming an ohel of 1 tefach wide over the grave, and that way you won't be creating an ohel. So the Gemara says, Ihachi my time of derabanan. Well, now that you've come up with all of these solutions, it's hard to understand the other side. The Chachamim hold that you're not allowed to create an eruv with truma tahora over a grave. So why not? If you've obviated all of the problems, kasavri asur liknos bayis b'isurei hana. The answer is, says the Gemara, it's got nothing to do with the issue of tumah. For the Chachamim, there's a separate issue, which is that you're not allowed to benefit from a grave. You know, there's a halacha that everyone agrees to. You're not allowed to benefit from a grave because there's a halacha that the space that a corpse occupies is asur bahana. You're not allowed to get any personal benefit from it. This is very practical applications bisman hazeh as well. I just had a shaila recently about a fellow who needed to disinter a parent from their burial site to transfer the remains to Eretz Yisrael, which you're permitted to do. But the question is, now what do you do with the empty grave? It's a commodity. It's a commodity with value. Can I get benefit from it? So we paskin no, you're not allowed to benefit from the grave. It goes back to the chevra. It goes back to the chevra kadisha. And then there's a whole shaila where the chevra kadisha is allowed to get hana from it. So there's ways to get around that, and some say that you should give it to an ani who can't afford a grave of their own, so that way no one's making money off of it. But in any event, the reason why the Chachamim say that you're not allowed to make an eruv there is because according to the Chachamim, you have to be able to be kind of shvisa, to acquire domain wherever the eruv is resting. If you're acquiring domain, and that domain is going to permit you to carry further not carry further, but to travel further on Shabbos because it's an eruv tchumen, so then you're benefiting from this spot. And this spot is asur bahana. That's the issue. So the Gemara now says, Michlal de Rabbi Yehuda savar mutter, kasavar mitzvahs lehap lehanos nitnu. So the Gemara says, well then how could Rabbi Yehuda say that it's mutter? Answers the Gemara is that Rabbi Yehuda says that the mitzvahs that you're doing are not of personal benefit. Mitzvahs lehap lehanos nitnu, that when a person is in the course of doing a mitzvah, he may get a personal geschmack out of doing the mitzvah, but that's not called a personal benefit. Now, as we're going to see momentarily, there's an opinion that states, and this is Rabbi Yehuda's opinion, that the rabbis only permitted you to make an eruv tchumen to extend your limits, to extend your boundaries, when you need to go do a mitzvah. Let's say, for example, there's a fellow sitting shiva who's outside my tchum, and I want to go to be menachem avel on Shabbos. You're allowed to be menachem avel on Shabbos. So, but the problem is I can't get to him because he's outside my tchum. So only in those situations where I'm going to do a mitzvah do Chazal permit me to make an eruv to extend my boundaries. But if it's not for a mitzvah, I'm not allowed to make an eruv tchumen. That's at least Rabbi Yehuda's opinion. And therefore, since it's not for personal benefit, I'm allowed to be kona shvisa on a grave, even though it's asur bahana, because I'm not getting any personal benefit from extending my boundaries, because I'm doing it only to do a mitzvah. So the Gemara says, Elahada Amar Rava Mitzvahs Lav Lehanos Nitnu Lema Kitanai Amar Lishmaite. So the Gemara's question now is, well then it seems to be like there's a machlokus here between the Chachamim and Rabbi Yehuda as to whether Mitzvahs Lehanos Nitnu or Mitzvahs Lav Lehanos Nitnu. When a person's in the course of doing a mitzvah, is he getting personal benefit or not? According to the Chachamim he is, which is why he cannot make an eruv in a place where it is asur bahana. And according to Rabbi Yehuda, it's permitted because mitzvahs lav lehanos nitnu. So Rava had a whole discussion in Maseches Rosh Hashanah as to whether or not you're allowed to blow shofar with a shofar that is asur b'hana. And Rava had said, of course you're allowed to, because you're not benefiting from the blowing of the shofar, because mitzvahs lav lehanos nitnu. But according to what we're saying now, it should be a machlokas tanoim. And Rava should have pointed that out, or the Gemara should have pointed that out, that what Rava is saying is a point of controversy among the tanoim. So the Gemara says, Amar lecha Rava, isvira lehu de'eina ma'arvin, ela ledvar mitzvah, the kuli alma mitzvahs lav lehanos nitnu. So he says, no. He says, you would be right if the Chachamim were of the opinion, like we said a moment ago, that the only time that you're allowed to make an eruv is for doing a mitzvah. Then we would have to concede that there's a machlokus whether mitzvahs lehanos nitnu or mitzvahs lav lehanos nitnu. But over here, the kuli alma mitzvahs lav lehanos nitnu v'hacha b'haka miflagi. Mar savra ein ma'arvin ela l'dvar mitzvah, or mar savra ma'arvin afilu l'dvar harishus. But here the machlokus is, when are you allowed to make an eruv tchumen and when you're not allowed to? Rabbi Yehuda says you're only allowed to make an eruv tchumen for a mitzvah purpose, and the Chachamim say no, even for a dvar rishus. Let's say you want to go visit a friend and there's no mitzvah involved, and he's outside your tchum. According to Rabbi Yehuda, it would be asur to make an eruv tchumen, and according to the Chachamim, it would be mutter to make an eruv tchumen. But since the Rabbanan hold, at least according to Rava, that you're allowed to go for a dvar rishus, then you're getting personal hana by the creation of the eruv, and then it would make sense why, according to the Chachamim, you're not allowed to become a shvisa, to acquire the domain in a place which is asur b'hana. So that's the machlokus, and therefore Rav will tell you that my assertion that mitzvahs lav lehanos nitnu is l'kuli alma, is according to everybody. So Elahada Amar Rav Yoseph ein ma'arvin ela dvar mitzvah le'mekitanai Amar l'shmaitei. So the Gemara says, well then, the way that you, Rava, are now explaining it, it seems that this is a whole machlokes as to whether you're allowed to make an eruv only for a dvar mitzvah or whether you're allowed to make it for a dvar rishus as well. So when Rav Yosef said that you're only allowed to make it for a dvar mitzvah, he should have qualified it and said that I'm going according to Rabbi Yehuda, not according to the Chachamim. So Amar Lacha Rav Yosef, the kuli alma ein ma'arvin ela ledvar mitzvah, with the kuli alma mitzvahs lav lehanos nitnu. So the Gemara says that Rav Yosef will explain to you as follows. No. Really, in reality, everyone holds that you're only allowed to make an eruv for a dvar mitzvah. And in reality, everyone holds that you're not allowed, that mitzvahs lav lehanos nitnu, that you're not getting any personal benefit when you're in the course of doing a mitzvah. But rather, what's the issue over here? Uvahaka miflagi. Mar savar kevin dekanale eruv lo nichale demintara. Machlokus is as follows. At what point am I performing a mitzvah by depositing my food parcel down over a piece of land? Really, the mitzvah action that I'm doing, in other words, to be kona shvisa, so that will enable me to do the mitzvah of visiting, of being menachem avel or whatever it is, takes place bein hashmashos. That takes place bein hashmashos. As long as the food parcel is there at the entrance of Shabbos, then no matter what happens to the food parcel afterwards, even if it gets consumed by a bolt of lightning, then I've been kona shvisa because it was there at the inception of Shabbos. The question now is, though, do I want the food parcel to be there for the remainder of Shabbos, or could I care less? Or I couldn't care less, right? The question is like this: after I've already been kona shvisa, I've acquired domain, do I still want to preserve the food after I've already created the eruv? And if the answer is yes, so then I am utilizing the soil where this food parcel is resting for personal use, because I'm no longer using the food parcel to create an eruv. I've already created the eruv when that Shabbos came in. But now that I want the food parcel to remain there so that if I get hungry on my trip out of the city, I'll be able to stop over and be able to pick up and have a bite, so then I want the food to remain there for personal benefit. So the Chachamim say that no, the mitzvah part of the creation of this eruv, that you're not doing for personal benefit. But you have a desire that the food should remain there for a few extra hours, so that when you actually travel outside the city, you'll be able to retrieve the food. And that's the personal benefit that's involved. And that's why, according to the Chachamim, you're not allowed to place the food over a grave, because a grave is asur fahana. But according to Rebbe Yehuda, you couldn't care less. According to Rebbe Yehuda, once you've put your food down and it's been kind of shvisa for you, you've acquired a domain and you've created your ERU that extends your boundaries, you don't care what happens to the food afterwards. You don't need it. If it's there, fine. If it's not there, also fine. So you're not getting any personal benefit from it. And therefore, there's no problem of putting the food over the grave, which is Aser B'Hana. Okay. A little bit complicated, but it's very elegant the way the Gemara explains it. Let's go on to the next Mishnah. Ma'arvin b'demai uv'maiser rishon shenitla trumaso uv'maiser sheni v'hektar sheniftu v'hakohanim b'chala. Now, we have seen different iterations of this Mishnah. We find this at least 5, 6, maybe even 7 times throughout Shas. Those of you who've been with us for at least a couple of months, maybe 3 months, well, certainly not more than 6 months, will remember this from the end of Kuf Chav Zayin, I think in Masechah Shabbos. We had a similar discussion. But it appears multiple times throughout Shas. This Mishnah tells us what foods you're allowed to make an Erev with, even though there's something a little bit questionable about the food from a halachic standpoint. First case is demai. Now, demai is a food that you buy from an Am Ha'aretz, and the rabbis required you to retithe Meiser Sheni and Trumas Meiser. The reason why, and Meiser Sheni is the second tithe that you bring up to Yerushalayim, and Trumas Meiser is the tithe that after you give the Meiser to the Levi has to take 10% of that and give it to a Kohen. We assume that the Am Haaretz has taken Truma Gedola because that's, of course, will render the food mamish usher for achila. But once he's taken Truma, we suspect that he may not have properly tithed the rest of the things that he's supposed to tithe. This is a chumrah that's only midirabanan, because really we assume that rov amei haaretz ma'aser inheim. We assume that most people, even if they're illiterate, they still take proper tithes. But the Chachamim created a chumrah to create a certain kind of class distinction between the amei haaretz and the Talmidei Chachamim in the community, and therefore they said you have to tithe demai. But if you didn't tithe your demai, you can still use that demai as an Eruv. The next thing is Meiser Rishon Shenitla Trumaso. If you have Meiser that was given to the Levi, and the Levi properly took Truma from it, you can use that Meiser for an Eruv. And of course the question is, well, isn't that obvious? You're overstating the obvious. What do you need to tell me that? The Gemara will clarify. Meiser Sheni v'hektish sheniftu, if you have Meiser Sheni that was redeemed onto coinage, or hektish that was redeemed onto coinage, these items are now chulin, and therefore you can use them as your Erev. That also seems to be obvious. Hacohen b'chala, and a Kohen is allowed to take his chala tithe, which is you give 1/24 or 1/48 of your dough to a Kohen, and he gets to use it for whatever he wants, and he can use that when he bakes it into a piece of bread or a loaf. He can use that as his Erev. Avalo b'tevel, but you're not allowed to use tevel. Tevel is completely untithed produce. That seems to be obvious, because we're going according to Simchas, who says that the food has to be edible in order for it to be a kosher Eruv. V'lo b'maiser rishon shelo nitla trumasa, nor can you use meiser that the trumas meiser was not tithed from it. V'lo b'maiser sheni v'hektish shelo niftu, nor can you use meiser sheni or hektish food that was not redeemed. And that also seems to be overstating the obvious, because if it wasn't redeemed, it's usher for you. So why does the Mishnah need to say it? So we're going to clarify all of these issues. The Gemara now says, Demai, halo chazilai. Why are you allowed to use Demai? Demai you're not allowed to eat until you tithe it. And since you can't tithe on Shabbos, you're not going to be able to utilize this food. You can't eat it on Shabbos. So why should you be allowed to make an Eruv? The Gemara answers, Migu. That the answer is that in theory this food is edible for you, because a person always has the opportunity to make himself into an ani by divesting all ownership of any assets. A person can do that even on Shabbos, and therefore he would automatically become an ani, and an ani is allowed to eat demai. The rabbis never restricted an ani from eating demai; they only restricted other people from eating demai.
Makes himself ani just by saying.
He makes a declaration in front of 3 people. Presumably, it's in front of 3 people. I hereby am mafkir. I hereby make hefker all of my assets. I don't recommend that you do this, Mr. Gruda. It's not a good idea.
I'm not doing that.
Right. Did none, and then people can take everything that you own. Right? If you make that declaration, did none. as the Mishnah says, machilin es aniyim demai, ve'es ha'achsanya demai, that you're allowed to feed demai to poor people and to Jewish soldiers who are traveling in a platoon through your town. They do not have to take demai. Now, Amar Rav Huna Tana Beishamai Omer Mein Machilin es aniyim demai, Beisil Omer Machilin es aniyim demai, and Rav Huna also points out that this is a machlokes Beishamai and Beisilel, and we go like Beisilel, who says that aniyim are allowed to eat demai. So that's the chiddush. The chiddush is that demai can be used as an eruv, since theoretically it's permitted if you were to make yourself into an ani. With a ma'aser rishon shenitla truma, so you're allowed to make an eruv with ma'aser rishon where the truma was tithed. So the Gemara says pshita. Isn't that obvious? Lo tzricha sheikdimo bashibolin v'nitla mimenu truma smaiser v'lo nitla mimenu or v'lo natla mimenu truma gedola. So the answer is, says the Gemara, that we're going according to a certain such scenario where the Levi jumped the gun. Now, what do we mean by that? Normally, when you tithe, the first tithe that you take is what we call truma gedola. It's 2% that you give. Let's say you have 100 bushels. You take 2 bushels, 2%, and you give it to the Kohen. You now have 98 bushels, and you take 10% of that and you give it to the Levi. So Levi now has 9.8 bushels, and from the 9.8 bushels, he has to take 10% of that, or 0.98 bushels, and give that to the Kohen. So it turns out that if everything is done properly, out of every 100 bushels, the Kohen will get 2.98 bushels. 2.98 bushels. You got that? All right. Okay, now, here comes a Levi. He says he's got a Levi complex. So he says, I'm not waiting for any Kohen to be first in line. I'm going to take my Meiser before the Kohen gets his Truma. He jumps ahead before even the guy is ready to tithe. He goes out into the field while it's still sheaves in the field, which is not yet the time to tithe anyway. You only normally start tithing once the grain has been removed from the stalk and the chaff, and it's in the silo. That's called miruach hakri, right? But he goes ahead while it's still sheaves of wheat in the field, and he takes his 10%. So he's taken now, instead of taking his 9.8 bushels, he's taken 10 full bushels, and he says, okay, I'll take Truma Smeiser, but I'm not going to give him the extra 2% that he'd normally be entitled to out of the portion that I took. So in that scenario, the balabas is left with 90 bushels. So the balabas has to only take 2% of 90 and give it to the Kohen. What's 2% of 90? 1.8 bushels. Going to give it. So he'll give the Kohen 1.8 bushels, and then the Levi will give him 10% of his 1 bushel, or of his 10 bushels, which will be 1 bushel. So therefore, it'll turn out that the Kohen will only get 2.8 instead of 2.98. He's only going to get 2.8 bushels. So basically, the Kohen is cheated out of 0.18 bushels out of every 100 bushels if the Levi jumps the gun. You got it? Okay, is that clear? I hope, does the math work out, Mendel?
Yes.
Okay, all right, good.
The Levi ends up with too much as well.
Well, the Levi jumped the gun. He shouldn't have done it. So he ends up with more than he should have taken. The Amar Reish Rabbi Avo Amar Reish Lakish Ma'aser Rishon Sheikdimu Bashibolin Potter Mitruma Gedola, and it's based on a pasuk that Reish Lakish tells us that if the Levi jumps the gun, we don't force him to relinquish the Truma Gedola, the extra 2%. Shenemar, as it says, V'harei Mosem Yimenu Trumas Hashem Ma'aser Min HaMa'aser. Because the Torah says that the Levi only has to take Trumas Meiser. Ma'aser Min HaMeiser Amarti L'cha, below Truma Gedola, Trumas Meiser Min HaMeiser. That's the only Truma that the Levi has to take is Trumas Meiser, but he doesn't have to take Truma Gedola. It's a special Gzeras HaKasef. And therefore, the chiddush is that even though this Levi jumped the gun and didn't take the Truma Gedola from this Meiser, we nevertheless allow you to use this Meiser as an Eruv. Amar le Rav Papa le Abaye iyachi afilu hikdimu b'kri nami. So Rav Papa says to Abaye, then why are you creating a scenario where the Levi jumped the gun so far in advance that it was sheaves of wheat in the field? Why don't you say that this is also the halacha? Look, if you have a pasuk like this, then it should also be the halacha when the Levi went in after the grain was already in the silo, before the balabas tithe truma gedola, he went ahead and he took his 10%. So the Gemara says, Amar lei alecha Amar kra mikol masaros sechem tarimu eis kol trumas Hashem. He says, because we have another pasuk, says Abaya, and that other pasuk goes against the previous pasuk. This pasuk says that for all meiser you always have to take all the trumas, which indicates that you have to take both truma gedola and trumas meiser, even from when the Levi jumped the gun. So the Gemara says, Umar rois. So why are you applying one pasuk to where he jumped the gun when it was still sheaves in the field, and you're applying the other pasuk to when it was already in the silo? Hi idgan v'hilo idgan. The answer is that one was made into grain and the other one was not yet made into grain. Once something becomes grain, it's subject to truma. And therefore the pasuk correctly says that if you jump the gun, Levi, since it was already chayiv in truma, you can't exempt yourself from taking truma gedola because it was already subject to tithing. And that's why that pasuk, the latter pasuk, is telling me that if it's already made into grain in the silo, then you as the Levi are obligated to take both trumas meiser and truma gedola and give the kohen that extra 0.18 bushels that he's entitled to. Uvameiser sheni vehektar sheniftu. And furthermore, the next part of the Mishnah was that you're allowed to make an eruv for meiser sheni and hektar that have been redeemed. So pshita, isn't that obvious? Lo tzricha shenosan sakern v'lonosan esachomish v'kamashmo den achomish ma'akev. So the Gemara answers no. The chiddush over here is that we know that whenever you redeem your produce onto coinage or you redeem hektish onto coinage, what do you have to do? If I have $100 worth of meiser sheni, and I don't want to have to schlep it up to Yerushalayim, I can redeem it onto coinage, but it's not $100 of coins; it's $125 of coins. I have to add a chomish. Let's say I go ahead and I'm a cheapskate and I only took $100 of coins and I pass the kedusha of the meiser sheni onto the coins. Does it work or does it not work? So b'di'evet it works, even though I didn't do it according to the halachic requirement of adding a chomish. But the meiser sheni still now becomes chulin, and that's the chiddush of the Mishnah, that even though I didn't add the chomish, the meiser sheni and the hektish is still now chulin, and I'm therefore allowed to use it for an eruv. Now the Gemara says of alo b'tevel. We saw the Mishnah that said that you're not allowed to use tevel as your eruv. So the Gemara says pshita. Isn't that obvious? It's not edible. The Gemara says lo tzricha b'tevel tavel midirabonin echagon shezara ba'otzit she'eno nakov. The answer is that no. We're talking about something that's only rabbinically tevel, such as, for example, where the produce did not grow directly from the soil, but grew from a pot, or grew hydroponically, in which case, midioraisa, it's putter from tithing, because it didn't grow properly in the soil of Eretz Yisrael. But nevertheless, the Chachamim still rabbinically required it to be tithed, and the chiddush of the Mishnah is that even though only rabbinically it needs trumas and meiser taken, you're still nevertheless not allowed to use it as an eruv. Below b'meiser rishon shelo nitlo trumaso, and furthermore, you're not allowed to use meiser rishon that didn't have its trumas meiser tithed. So the Gemara says, pshita, this too is obvious. Answers the Gemara, lo tzricha shikdimu b'kri v'not lo mimenu trumas meiser v'lo not lo mimenu truma gedol. Mahu deteme kedamar le Rav Papa le Abaya kamash malan kiddushani le. Answers the Gemara, you know what we're talking about? The previous case that we had addressed just a moment before. We're talking about where a Levi jumped the gun, but instead of jumping the gun out in the field when it was in sheaves, he jumped the gun later on when it was already in the granary, when it was already in the silo. And in that situation, if the Levi does not take Truma Gedola together with the Trumas Meiser, then it's still tevel, it's still not properly tithed. And so therefore, the Havamina was, you might have thought that because, just like Rav Papa had questioned Abaya, hey, if the Levi doesn't have to take Truma Gedola when it's sheaves in the field, maybe he also doesn't have to take Truma Gedola when it's in the silo. Kamash Malan, so tells us the Mishnah that no, since he jumped the gun after it already had become grain, therefore he cannot exempt himself from taking Truma Gedola, and therefore it's considered to be usher for consumption until he takes the Truma Gedola. Let's go on. V'lo b'meiser sheni v'hektar shelo niftu. You're not allowed to use meiser sheni and hektar that have not yet been redeemed. So the Gemara says this too is pshita. Isn't that obvious? It's not edible. The Gemara says lo tzricha shepida'an v'lo pida'an ki hilchasa. The answer is that you did a redemption onto coinage, or you did a redemption, but you didn't redeem it properly. So what do we mean? Meiser shepido al gabi asimon v'rachman omer v'tzarta kesef sheishel of tzura. So in the case of meiser sheni, the Torah says v'tzarta kesef. you shall bundle the money. But the word vitzarta doesn't just mean bundle the money, but it also means make sure that the kesef has a tzura, that it's been properly minted with a face on it. If I go ahead and I take a slug, an asimon, right, and I transfer the kedusha of the Meiser Sheni onto the coinage, onto the slug, I have not properly redeemed it, and therefore the Meiser Sheni remains in its kedusha status. And similarly, hektish shechilul al gav karka derachmana omer v'nosana kesef v'kamla. And by hektish, what's an improper way of redeeming hektish? You can redeem hektish on any chattel, any movable property. But if it's real estate, then you cannot be pota hektish onto real estate. And if I try to do that, the chiddush of the Mishnah is that I have not redeemed it at all, to the point where I can't use this hektish as to make an eruv. Let's go on. The Mishnah, yes?
The part that sold, you only gave 100%, not the 125.
Yes.
How does that, what's the process after that?
The process is that he owes money to the Beis HaMikdash.
So, okay, or produce.
Or he has to purchase additional produce. But the point is that he did an Aveira, but the produce is still redeemed, or the hektish is still redeemed.
Okay, so now let's say he has more produce. Let's say the first 25% that he's still owing automatically, that becomes hektish?
No.
Somewhere down the line he still owes.
It's just a debt. He has a debt. Okay? I don't know. It could be by Meiser Sheni that the debt dissipates at some point. I don't know. But with hektish, it would seem that it's a debt that he has to an entity, to the hektish entity. Now, Mishnah. Hashaleach eruv biyad chereshoyte v'katan o biyad misha eno moda be'eruv eno eruv. Now the Mishnah is telling me that I'm allowed to appoint a shaliach, a proxy, to set up the eruv for me. And what the Mishnah is therefore telling me is that I have to make sure that the person who I appoint as my shaliach is an appropriate party. Number one, he has to be of sound mind. So if he's a cheres shaita or a katan, if he's a deaf mute, if he's mentally incapacitated, or if he's a minor, then he's not capable of setting up the eruv for me. And number two, if he does not acknowledge the efficacy of eruv, then he also cannot be trusted to set up the eruv for me. And but in all of those aforementioned, if you appoint a third party to say, hey, I got this child who's going to be meeting you, please take the eruv from him and set it up for me, so then that will work. That will work. So the Gemara now says, let's analyze this. The katan lo. So first of all, you're telling me that a katan is not trusted to set up an eruv? The ha'amar Rav Huna katan gova es eruv. Didn't Rav Huna teach that a katan is allowed to collect the eruv? It is kosher for a katan. The Gemara says, lo kasha kan be'eruv itchumen kan be'eruv chatzera. So the Gemara tells me that our Mishnah, even though up until now the previous Mishnahs were dealing with, when they said that you use the word eruv, we were talking about both an eruv chatzeros and an eruv tchumen. Here, there's a differentiation between eruv chatzeros and eruv tchumen. When it comes to eruv tchumen, you need a bardas. You need someone who has knowledge, because he has to be kind of shvisa. He has to acquire domain. In order to make a kinyan, you have to be a bardas. Okay. But when it comes to collecting the eruv, everyone has to, for a chatzer, to incorporate the chatzer, where everyone gives a little piece of dough or a little piece of bread or a little piece of matzah, and we all join together, we can entrust the child to collect the pieces of matzah from every member of the shchuna. Why? Because he's not being kaina anything, he's just creating a corporate entity of a pot where everyone contributes. So he's not really being kaina anything, and therefore he can be trusted. So that's the difference. That's why. So by a chatzer, a katan can create an eruv, but by eruv tchumen, he cannot be kaina shvisa. So Gemara now says, O biyad misha inamoda be'eruv, or someone who doesn't acknowledge the efficacy of an eruv. Man, who is that? Somer of chista kutoi. That's referring to a Kutite, which either is a Samaritan, some kind of sectarian, early Christian, we're not really sure. Could refer to a number of different people. But the point is that he denies Torah Shabbat Peh, and therefore he cannot be, since he doesn't believe in the whole concept, the whole institution of eruv, he cannot be trusted to establish it. But if you tell a third party, hey, you're going to see this guy walking down the street, please take the food from him and set up the eruv, then it's okay. So frak the Gemara v'leichosh malo mamtile. Why shouldn't you worry that the child that you sent with the food is never going to actually make it down the street to bring it to the guy that you told that you said would meet him at the corner? So the Gemara says, We're talking about a case, Rav Chisda says, in another situation. Rav Chisda says you're looking at a distance and you can see the child walking. So hachanami ba'omin v'ro ehu. So that's what our Mishnah is talking about. You see the child walking down the street, so you know that he's going to the destination where you told the guy to meet him. So v'leichosh dilma lo shakol minei. So then why shouldn't you worry? Maybe you should worry that the third party is not going to meet him there. Is not going to take it from him and set up the ERU. Kedamar of Yechiel chazaka shliachos shlichusa. Hachanami chazaka shliachos shlichusa. So Rav Yechiel in a similar case had said that we can assume there's a chazaka that when you appoint someone to be a shaliach, you can assume they're going to do the job. If they accept the shlichus, you can assume that they're going to do it. So too over here. You can assume that if you told the third party, do me a favor and pick up the ERU from the kid, you can assume that he's going to do it and he's going to be kind of shvisa. The heicha itmer de Rav Chisda Rav Yechiel. Where did Rav Chisda Rav Yechiel originate those statements? Aha itmar. About the following case. The Tanya nasan l'pil v'holicho l'kof v'holicho ein ze eruv. That if you have a pet elephant or a pet monkey, and you ask them, you send them, because you can train monkeys and elephants to do things that people do, and you can send them, you take a basket of food, you put it in the elephant's trunk, and you say, here Tiny, go ahead and take this food parcel and walk down the street with it. Right? So Tiny goes, and he's walking down the street. That would be a big spectacle in Thornhill, wouldn't it? And you got the elephant going down the street with a basket of food in its trunk, and then you have your friend meet the elephant and take the food from him. So if you have the elephant deposit the food, since the elephant has no das, he can't be kind of shvisa. But if you assign your friend Ruvain to pick up the basket from Tiny, so then it'll work, because you can. So the Gemara now says, how do you know that the elephant is going to walk down and do what you told him to do? Because you see the elephant walking down the street, right? If you see the elephant walking down the street, I have a good doctor for you. But then the Gemara says, but maybe your friend Reuven is not going to pick it up from the elephant. How do you know he's going to pick it up and then put it down to be koina and eruv? So Rabbi Yechiel chazaka shliachos shlichus. So there it's what Rabbi Yechiel said. You can assume that if you ask your friend to pick up the food from the elephant, he's going to pick it up. Amar Rav Nachman b'shal Torah ein chazaka shliachos shlichuso b'shal seifrim chazaka shliachos shlichuso. And here comes along Rav Nachman. He tells us, listen, I got to qualify Rav Yechiel's statement. The only time that we assume that a shliach has done his shlichus is only by rabbinic law, such as the creation of an eruv, which at least according to some opinions is only a din d'Rabbanan. But when it comes to Torah law, when it comes to biblical law, all bets are off, and you cannot assume that a shliach is always going to do a shlichus. You have to verify it in order to make sure that it was done. And Rav Sheshes Amar echad zeh v'echad zeh chazaka shlichus shlichus. Rav Sheshes says no. Both in biblical law and rabbinic law, once a shliach says I'll do it, you can assume that it was done.